The salt air hit differently that morning at Harbor Point Marina, carrying with it the sharp tang of diesel fuel and the distant cry of seagulls circling above the docks. The sun had barely crested the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, but Marcus Thompson was already elbow-deep in the engine compartment of a fishing trawler, his weathered hands moving with the practiced precision of someone who had spent 30 years understanding the language of machines. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. He didn't look like much to the wealthy yacht owners who frequented this part of the marina. His coveralls were stained with years of honest work, his gray hair peppered with streaks of the black it used to be, and his face bore the deep lines of a man who had raised 3 kids on a mechanic's salary after his wife passed away from cancer 7 years ago. But what Marcus lacked in appearance, he made up for in skill. There wasn't an engine in this marina he couldn't diagnose within minutes, no problem too complex for his steady hands and sharper mind. The morning started like any other. Marcus had arrived at Oceanside Marine Services at 5:30, just as he had done for the past 12 years. The small repair shop sat at the edge of the premium yacht section, a modest building that served as the backbone for keeping the million-dollar vessels running smoothly. His boss, Robert Chen, a decent man who valued hard work over pretension, had always appreciated Marcus's dedication. The older mechanic never complained, never asked for time off, and never turned away a job no matter how difficult. His 3 children, now grown and pursuing their own dreams, often told him he worked too hard, that he should slow down and enjoy life. But Marcus found peace in the rhythmic hum of engines and the satisfaction of solving problems that left others scratching their heads. Work wasn't just work for him. It was purpose. It was the way he honored his late wife's memory by ensuring their kids never went without, even if it meant his own hands were permanently stained with grease and his back ached at the end of every shift. The trouble began when Victoria Langford arrived. She swept into the marina that Tuesday morning like a storm front nobody had predicted, her presence announced by the purr of her silver Bentley and the click of designer heels against the weathered wooden planks of the dock. Victoria was the CEO of Langford Tech Solutions, a software empire worth billions, and she carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone who had never heard the word no without immediately overturning it. She was in her early 40s, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than Marcus made in 3 months, and her dark hair was pulled back in a style that screamed efficiency and control. She had recently purchased a yacht, not just any yacht, but a custom-built masterpiece valued at $5 million, complete with state-of-the-art navigation systems, luxury accommodations, and twin engines that represented the pinnacle of marine engineering. The vessel, christened the Pinnacle, was her pride and joy, a floating testament to her success and a tool for entertaining investors and closing deals in international waters. Victoria had scheduled a major voyage for that coming weekend. She was hosting a gathering of potential investors from 3 different countries, a crucial meeting that could secure funding for her company's latest venture into quantum computing development. Everything had been planned to perfection, from the catering to the entertainment, and the yacht was supposed to be the crown jewel that demonstrated her attention to detail and her capacity for excellence. But that morning, when her captain, a stern Norwegian named Olaf, attempted to start the engines for a routine systems check, nothing happened. Not a sputter, not a cough, just dead silence. Olaf, who had 35 years of maritime experience, ran through every diagnostic he knew. He checked fuel lines, examined electrical systems, and even called in his first mate for a second opinion. Nothing. The engines, which had been functioning perfectly just 3 days prior, now sat as lifeless as anchors. That's when Victoria made the call to Oceanside Marine Services. Robert Chen took the call personally, and when he heard who was on the line and the urgency in her voice, he immediately assigned his best mechanic to the job. Marcus was finishing up the trawler repair when Robert appeared in the doorway of the workshop, his expression a mixture of stress and hope. He explained the situation quickly, emphasizing that this was not just any client but someone whose satisfaction could mean substantial future business for their small operation. Marcus simply nodded, wiped his hands on a rag, and gathered his tools. He had dealt with high-pressure situations before. Wealthy clients came with the territory in this part of the marina, and he had learned long ago to let his work speak for itself rather than being intimidated by bank accounts and brand names. When Marcus arrived at Slip 47 where the Pinnacle was moored, he couldn't help but appreciate the vessel's beauty. It was sleek and modern, all clean lines and polished surfaces that gleamed in the morning sunlight. Victoria stood on the dock with her arms crossed, flanked by Olaf and two of her personal assistants who were frantically typing on tablets and making phone calls. She barely glanced at Marcus as he approached, her attention fixed on her phone screen where she was clearly dealing with multiple crises simultaneously. Olaf, however, greeted him with a firm handshake and a weary expression that suggested he was relieved to have an expert on site. The captain led Marcus aboard and down to the engine room, explaining everything he had already tried. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Marcus listened carefully, asking clarifying questions and mentally cataloging the information. The engine room was immaculate, a testament to proper maintenance, which actually made the problem more puzzling. Marcus spent the next hour conducting a thorough examination. He tested fuel pressure, inspected spark plugs, traced electrical circuits, and even pulled out the engine's diagnostic computer to run a full systems analysis. Throughout this process, Victoria made several visits to the engine room, each time growing more agitated as Marcus worked methodically through his checklist. She wasn't accustomed to waiting, and patience was not listed among her virtues. She made comments about time frames and asked pointed questions about his qualifications, each query carrying an undertone of doubt that Marcus chose to ignore. He was focused on the puzzle in front of him, and his years of experience had taught him that rushing never solved complex problems, it only created new ones. Finally, after nearly 90 minutes of investigation, Marcus found it. The issue wasn't mechanical at all. Someone, likely during a recent software update to the yacht's integrated control system, had inadvertently corrupted a crucial piece of code that managed the engine startup sequence. It was an extremely rare problem, one that wouldn't show up on standard diagnostics because the engines themselves were fine. The computer simply couldn't tell them to start. Marcus emerged from the engine room and found Victoria on the main deck, her phone pressed to her ear as she paced back and forth. When she ended her call and turned to him, her expression was expectant and impatient. He explained the problem in clear terms, avoiding technical jargon, and outlined the solution. It would require accessing the yacht's main computer system, isolating the corrupted code, and either repairing or replacing it with a clean version. The work itself wasn't particularly difficult for someone with his experience in modern marine systems, but it was time-consuming and required careful attention to avoid causing additional problems. He estimated it would take 4 to 5 hours to complete properly. Victoria's face darkened. She didn't have 4 to 5 hours. She needed the yacht operational immediately. Marcus remained calm and explained that rushing this particular repair could result in worse complications or even damage to the yacht's entire computer network. He suggested she reschedule her weekend voyage or consider using a different vessel. That's when everything changed. Victoria's voice rose sharply, cutting through the peaceful morning air and attracting the attention of people on neighboring boats. She accused Marcus of incompetence, suggesting that a truly skilled mechanic would have solved this problem already. She questioned his credentials, his methods, and even implied that he was deliberately moving slowly to rack up billable hours. Marcus stood there quietly, his tool bag at his feet, his expression neutral despite the sting of her words. He had encountered difficult clients before, but something about Victoria's tone was particularly cutting, perhaps because it echoed the same dismissiveness he had faced his entire career from people who judged him by his appearance rather than his abilities. Olaf tried to intervene, explaining to Victoria that Marcus was highly respected in the marina community and that his assessment was likely accurate, but she wasn't interested in hearing it. She was focused on her problem and her timeline, and Marcus represented an obstacle rather than a solution. Then Victoria made a decision that would reverberate through the following days in ways she couldn't imagine. She pulled out her phone and began recording. She announced loudly that she was documenting this interaction for her legal team and social media followers, and she proceeded to berate Marcus on camera. She criticized his work ethic, his appearance, and his supposed inability to perform basic repairs. She made sweeping statements about the declining quality of skilled labor and suggested that Oceanside Marine Services should be ashamed for sending someone so clearly out of his depth to work on a vessel of this caliber. Her assistants stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. Other yacht owners and marina workers had stopped what they were doing, drawn by the commotion. And Marcus stood there, his weathered face flushing not with anger but with humiliation, as this woman who knew nothing about him or his life reduced 30 years of expertise to a public spectacle for her phone camera. When she finally finished her tirade, Victoria delivered her final blow. She called Robert Chin directly, her voice loud enough for everyone present to hear through the phone speaker. She demanded that Marcus be removed from her job immediately and insisted that he be fired from Oceanside Marine Services entirely. She threatened to leave scathing reviews across every platform and to ensure that none of her wealthy friends ever used their services again if this incompetent mechanic remained on their staff. Robert, caught between losing a potentially major client and defending an employee he respected, found himself in an impossible position. The phone call lasted less than 5 minutes. When it ended, Victoria handed her phone to one of her assistants and looked at Marcus with an expression of cold satisfaction. Robert had agreed to remove him from the job and suspend him pending further review. Marcus was to collect his tools and leave the marina immediately. The walk back to the workshop was the longest of Marcus's life. Other mechanics and dock workers who had witnessed the scene or heard about it looked at him with mixtures of sympathy and awkwardness. Nobody knew what to say. Marcus packed his tools in silence, his hands steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. He had been humiliated publicly, recorded for posterity, and now faced the possibility of losing the job that had been his anchor for over a decade. When he arrived at the workshop, Robert was waiting, his face etched with genuine distress. The conversation was brief and painful. Robert explained that he had no choice, that Victoria's influence could destroy their small business, and that the suspension was just a formality until things cooled down. Marcus understood. He didn't blame Robert. He simply nodded, turned in his work ID, and drove home in his 20-year-old pickup truck, the same vehicle he had been driving since before his wife died, too numb to even feel angry. The house felt emptier than usual when Marcus walked through the front door that afternoon. It was a small ranch-style home in a working-class neighborhood called Riverside Heights, where the lawns were neatly kept but the cars in the driveways were rarely new, and people knew their neighbors by name. He had bought this house 23 years ago with his wife, Amanda, back when they were young and full of dreams about raising a family and building a life together. The mortgage had been paid off for 5 years now, one of the few financial victories he allowed himself to feel proud of, but the house still carried the weight of her absence in every corner. Her favorite chair sat in the living room, a floral-patterned recliner she used to curl up in with a book on Sunday afternoons. Marcus couldn't bring himself to sit in it, even after all these years. He set his tool bag down by the door with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the silence. His hands were shaking slightly, an unfamiliar tremor that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with the humiliation that was still burning through his chest like hot coals. He walked to the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, staring out the window at the backyard where a tire swing hung from an old oak tree, a relic from when his kids were small enough to fight over who got to swing first. His eldest daughter, Jennifer, was now a nurse in Portland, working double shifts at a hospital and saving lives while barely making enough to cover her student loans. His son, Michael, taught high school English in a district that couldn't afford new textbooks, pouring his own money into supplies for kids who reminded him why education mattered. And his youngest, Emma, was finishing her final year of law school, studying late into every night with the determination of someone who wanted to make her parents proud even though her mother would never see her graduate. Marcus had called none of them. He didn't know what he would say. How do you tell your children, the people who look up to you as a provider and a pillar of strength, that you had been torn down in front of strangers and reduced to a spectacle for someone's social media outrage? He could already imagine their reactions. Jennifer would get angry, her protective instincts flaring as she demanded justice. Michael would try to intellectualize it, to find meaning in the cruelty. And Emma, his little fighter, would probably want to file a lawsuit and make Victoria pay for what she had done. But Marcus didn't want any of that. He just wanted the world to stop spinning for a moment so he could catch his breath and figure out what came next. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Marcus tried to distract himself with household chores, tasks he had been putting off for weeks. He fixed a leaky faucet in the bathroom, replaced a burned-out light bulb in the hallway, and even swept the garage, but nothing could quiet the storm in his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Victoria's face, that cold expression of superiority as she recorded him, as she spoke about him like he was nothing more than an inconvenience to be dealt with and discarded. He had worked so hard his entire life to build a reputation, to be known as someone reliable and skilled, and in less than 10 minutes, she had tried to dismantle all of it. By evening, word had spread through the marina community. Marcus's phone began buzzing with text messages from coworkers and friends who had heard what happened. Some offered sympathy and support, telling him that everyone knew Victoria was out of line and that his reputation would survive this storm. Others shared their own stories of being mistreated by wealthy clients who viewed service workers as beneath them, a strange sort of solidarity that came from shared indignity. One message came from Tommy Rodriguez, a young apprentice mechanic who had started at Oceanside just 6 months ago. Tommy wrote that Marcus had been the only person at the marina who treated him with respect from day one, who took the time to teach him properly instead of just barking orders, and that he would never forget that kindness. The message made Marcus's throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. But there was one message that stood out among all the others. It came from Olaf, the captain of the Pinnacle. The Norwegian had typed out a long text explaining that he had witnessed everything and felt terrible about how things had unfolded. He wrote that Victoria had a habit of treating people poorly when things didn't go her way, but that this incident had crossed a line even by her standards. Olaf mentioned that he had been working for Victoria for only 8 months and was already considering resigning because the environment was becoming increasingly toxic. He ended the message by saying that if Marcus ever needed someone to vouch for his professionalism and expertise, he would do so without hesitation. Marcus read the message 3 times, feeling a small flicker of warmth in the cold emptiness that had settled over him. At least someone had seen the truth. The next morning arrived with a gray sky that matched Marcus's mood. He woke early out of habit, his body trained by years of early shifts to rise before dawn regardless of whether he had somewhere to be. He made coffee in the old percolator Amanda had bought at a yard sale 2 decades ago, the same one she had insisted made the best coffee even though it took twice as long as a modern machine. He sat at the kitchen table with his mug, watching the sky slowly lighten through the window, and tried to figure out what he was supposed to do with his day. For 12 years, his routine had been ironclad. Wake up, drive to the marina, work until his hands were sore and his back ached, come home, eat something simple, and fall asleep with the satisfaction of a day well spent. Now that routine was shattered, and the absence of structure felt disorienting. His phone rang just after 7. It was Robert Chen. Marcus hesitated before answering, not sure he was ready to hear whatever his boss had to say, but he picked up on the 4th ring. Robert's voice was strained and apologetic. He explained that Victoria had indeed posted the video on her social media accounts, and it had gained significant traction overnight. Thousands of people had viewed it, and the comments section was a battlefield of opinions. Some people sided with Victoria, agreeing that service providers should be held accountable for subpar work. But a surprising number of comments defended Marcus, pointing out that he had clearly explained the problem and the solution, and that Victoria's treatment of him had been unnecessarily cruel and condescending. A few people even recognized Marcus from the marina and spoke up about his reputation as one of the best marine mechanics on the entire coast. Robert went on to say that the situation had put him in an impossible position. Several other clients had called that morning, some threatening to take their business elsewhere if Marcus wasn't reinstated, while others, friends of Victoria from her social circle, had demanded assurances that he would never work on their vessels. The small business owner sounded exhausted, caught between competing pressures that had no easy resolution. He told Marcus that the suspension would need to remain in place for at least a week while things settled down, but that he hoped they could find a way forward once the dust cleared. Marcus listened quietly and thanked Robert for the call, even though gratitude was the last thing he felt. When the conversation ended, he set the phone down and stared at it as if it were a foreign object he no longer understood. The day stretched out before him like an empty highway with no destination in sight. Marcus decided to take a drive, needing to escape the confines of his house where every room reminded him of either happier times or present failures. He climbed into his pickup truck, the engine turning over with a familiar rumble that had always brought him comfort, and headed toward the coast. The drive took 40 minutes, winding through small towns and rural stretches where farms gave way to forests and eventually to the rocky shoreline where the Pacific Ocean crashed against ancient stone formations. He parked at a scenic overlook that he and Amanda used to visit when they needed to think or talk through difficult decisions. The wind was strong up here, carrying the salt spray and the cries of gulls, and Marcus stood at the edge of the viewpoint, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, staring out at the endless expanse of gray-blue water. He thought about his father, a man who had worked in construction his entire life and had taught Marcus the value of honest labor and taking pride in craftsmanship. His father had always said that a person's worth wasn't measured by their bank account or the title on their business card, but by the integrity they brought to their work and the kindness they showed to others. Marcus had tried to live by that philosophy, had raised his children with those same values, and yet here he was, punished for doing exactly what he had been taught to do. Tell the truth, provide honest assessments, and refuse to cut corners even when pressured. Where had that gotten him? Standing on a cliff, unemployed and humiliated, wondering if the principles he had built his life around were just naive fantasies in a world that rewarded ruthlessness and punished decency. The ocean offered no answers, just the steady rhythm of waves that had been crashing against these rocks for millions of years, indifferent to human struggles and fleeting troubles. Marcus stood there for over an hour, letting the wind numb his face and the sound of the surf drown out the noise in his head. Eventually, the cold drove him back to his truck, and he started the long drive home, no more enlightened than when he had arrived but perhaps slightly more resigned to whatever came next. When he pulled into his driveway that afternoon, he noticed a car parked across the street that he didn't recognize. It was a modest sedan, nothing fancy, and as he climbed out of his truck, the driver's side door opened and a woman stepped out. She was in her 60s, dressed in casual clothes, with short silver hair and a gentle face that seemed kind even from a distance. She walked toward him with purpose but not aggression, and when she got close enough, she introduced herself as Helen Brennan. The name meant nothing to Marcus until she explained that she was Olaf's aunt, and that her nephew had told her what had happened at the marina. She had driven an hour from her home in Bayshore specifically to speak with him. Marcus was caught off guard but invited her inside, the ingrained politeness of his upbringing overriding his confusion. They sat in the living room, and Helen declined his offer of coffee, saying she wouldn't take up much of his time. She explained that Olaf had been deeply troubled by the incident and had called her the previous evening to talk through his frustration and guilt. Helen had spent 30 years as a human resources director for a major shipping company before retiring, and she had seen countless cases of workplace mistreatment and abuse of power. What Victoria had done, she explained, wasn't just rude or unprofessional. It was potentially actionable, especially since it had been recorded and shared publicly. The video could be seen as defamation, and depending on how it affected Marcus's ability to find future work, there might be grounds for legal recourse. Marcus listened politely but shook his head when she finished. He wasn't interested in lawsuits or legal battles. He didn't have the money for lawyers, and even if he did, he wasn't sure he had the energy to fight someone like Victoria Langford, a woman with unlimited resources and a team of attorneys on retainer. Helen seemed to understand his reluctance, but she pressed gently, explaining that sometimes standing up to bullies wasn't just about personal vindication but about preventing them from doing the same thing to others. She mentioned that Olaf had told her about several other incidents involving Victoria's treatment of staff and contractors, incidents that had been swept under the rug because people were afraid to speak up. Marcus appreciated her concern, truly he did, but he wasn't a crusader. He was just a mechanic who wanted to work in peace and provide for what remained of his family. Helen stayed for another 20 minutes, sharing stories about her nephew and expressing her admiration for people like Marcus who dedicated their lives to skilled trades that kept the world running. When she finally left, she pressed a business card into his hand with her personal phone number written on the back, telling him to call if he changed his mind or if he just needed someone to talk to who understood workplace dynamics. Marcus thanked her and watched her drive away, then looked down at the card in his hand. He wasn't sure why, but he didn't throw it away. Instead, he tucked it into his wallet, a small gesture that felt like keeping a door open even though he had no intention of walking through it. That night, Marcus's phone rang again. This time it was Jennifer, his eldest daughter. Someone had sent her the video, probably a friend who had seen it circulating online and recognized her last name. She was furious, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage as she demanded to know why he hadn't told her what happened. Marcus tried to downplay the situation, to assure her that everything would be fine and that she didn't need to worry, but Jennifer wasn't having it. She had inherited her mother's fierce protective instincts and her father's stubborn determination, a combination that made her a formidable advocate when someone she loved was threatened. She told him she was taking time off work and driving down to stay with him for a few days, and before he could protest, she had already hung up to make arrangements. Michael called an hour later, having heard from his sister. He was calmer than Jennifer but no less concerned. He asked thoughtful questions about what had happened and listened carefully to Marcus's answers, and then he said something that struck deeper than expected. He told his father that one of the most important lessons he had learned from him was that doing the right thing often came with a cost, but that the cost of compromising your integrity was always higher in the long run. He said that his students needed teachers who believed that, and that he needed to know his father still believed it too, even after everything that had happened. Marcus felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, an unfamiliar sensation that he blinked away quickly. He assured Michael that he did still believe it, even if that belief felt shaky at the moment. Emma called last, her voice tight with barely suppressed fury. She had watched the video multiple times, analyzing it with the critical eye of someone training to be a lawyer, and she had already drafted a preliminary complaint outlining potential causes of action. She rattled off legal terms like defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with business relationships, explaining how each might apply to the situation. Marcus listened with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. His daughter was brilliant and passionate, and he loved that about her, but he also knew that turning this into a legal battle would consume time, energy, and resources that he wasn't sure he possessed. He gently told her that he appreciated her research but wasn't ready to pursue legal action. Emma argued for 10 minutes, laying out all the reasons why he should fight back, but eventually she relented with a frustrated sigh and made him promise to at least think about it. After the calls ended, Marcus sat in the darkened living room with only the pale glow of a streetlight filtering through the curtains. His children's reactions had stirred something inside him, a mixture of gratitude and guilt. They believed in him, trusted that he had done the right thing, and wanted to defend him against someone who had treated him unfairly. But he also felt the weight of their expectations, the sense that he was supposed to be strong enough to weather this storm without flinching. He thought about Amanda and what she would have said if she were still here. She had always been his compass, the person who could cut through his doubts and help him see situations clearly. He suspected she would have told him to hold his head high, to remember that his worth wasn't determined by Victoria Langford's opinion or anyone else's, and to trust that the truth had a way of emerging even when it seemed buried under layers of noise and spectacle. The week crawled forward with agonizing slowness. Marcus tried to fill his days with projects around the house, tasks that had been neglected during years of long work hours. He repainted the kitchen, fixed the fence in the backyard, and reorganized the garage until every tool hung in its proper place. Jennifer arrived on Wednesday, true to her word, and spent 3 days fussing over him, cooking meals he barely tasted and insisting they watch old movies together like they used to when she was young. Her presence helped, providing a distraction from the constant loop of thoughts that threatened to overwhelm him, but it also reminded him of how much he missed having family close by, how the house felt too big and too quiet most of the time. By Friday, Robert called again with news that the situation at the marina had taken an unexpected turn, but Marcus would have to wait to hear what had happened because that part of the story was still unfolding in ways nobody could have predicted. Victoria Langford had never been the type of person to second-guess her decisions. She had built an empire through decisive action and unwavering confidence in her own judgment, and the incident with the mechanic at the marina was, in her mind, simply another example of her refusing to tolerate mediocrity. After firing Marcus and posting the video to her social media accounts, she had moved on to the dozen other urgent matters demanding her attention that day. The yacht situation was frustrating, certainly, but she had already contacted 3 other marine repair companies, each promising to send their top technicians to assess the problem. Money could solve most obstacles, and Victoria had plenty of it. The first team arrived within hours of Marcus's departure. They were from Premium Marine Solutions, a high-end service company that catered exclusively to luxury yacht owners and charged rates that would make most people's eyes water. 2 technicians in crisp uniforms spent 3 hours examining the Pinnacle's engine systems, running diagnostics, and conferring in hushed tones that suggested deep expertise. When they emerged from the engine room, their assessment was troubling. They confirmed that the engines themselves appeared mechanically sound, but they couldn't pinpoint the source of the startup failure. One technician suggested it might be an electrical issue, while the other leaned toward a fuel delivery problem, though neither seemed entirely convinced by their own theories. They recommended replacing several components as a precautionary measure, work that would take at least 2 days and cost upward of $15,000 with no guarantee of success. Victoria's jaw tightened as she listened to their uncertain prognosis. She didn't have 2 days to gamble on maybe solutions. Her investor meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning, less than 48 hours away, and everything depended on this yacht being operational. She dismissed Premium Marine Solutions and immediately contacted the next company on her list. By late Tuesday afternoon, a second team had arrived, this one from Coastal Elite Yacht Services. They were equally professional, equally expensive, and equally stumped. After their examination, they suggested the problem might be related to the yacht's computer systems, which was closer to Marcus's original diagnosis than Victoria would ever admit, but they didn't have a marine systems programming specialist available until the following week. They could attempt some basic troubleshooting, they offered, but strongly advised against it given the complexity of the Pinnacle's integrated technology. Forcing incorrect solutions could create cascading failures that would take weeks to repair. Victoria sent them away with barely concealed frustration. By Wednesday morning, she had cycled through 2 more companies, each arriving with promises of quick solutions and departing with apologetic explanations about why this particular problem fell outside their expertise. One team admitted they had never worked on this specific engine model before. Another confessed that the yacht's custom computer integration was beyond their training. With each failed attempt, Victoria's anxiety mounted. The investor meeting represented months of careful planning and relationship building. 3 major venture capital firms were flying in specifically for this voyage, along with representatives from a consortium of international tech investors. The setting was meant to project success, stability, and forward-thinking innovation. Canceling or relocating at the last minute would signal exactly the opposite. Wednesday afternoon brought an unexpected complication. Olaf, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the situation, approached Victoria on the dock with news that made her blood run cold. One of the investors, a notoriously particular Japanese businessman named Hiroshi Tanaka, had very specific requirements for any meeting venue. His team had already confirmed the yacht's specifications and location, and changing plans now would likely result in his withdrawal from the entire deal. Tanaka controlled a network of investors worth nearly $2 billion in potential funding. Losing him would collapse the entire purpose of the meeting. Victoria felt the walls closing in. She had built her career on being the person who solved impossible problems, who refused to accept defeat, and yet here she stood on a dock staring at a $5 million yacht that might as well have been a very expensive paperweight. That evening, Victoria sat in her penthouse apartment overlooking the harbor, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside her. The city lights glittered below like a constellation of earthbound stars, and somewhere in that sprawl of buildings and streets, the mechanic she had publicly humiliated was probably sitting in his modest home, his life disrupted by her anger and impatience. For the first time since the incident, Victoria allowed herself to replay the confrontation in her mind without the filter of justification and righteous indignation. She remembered the look on Marcus's face as she berated him, not defiant or angry, but quietly resigned, as if he had expected nothing better from someone like her. She remembered how he had stood there with his worn coveralls and grease-stained hands while she lectured him about professionalism, and how he had simply collected his tools and left without defending himself or lashing out. Victoria's phone buzzed with a notification. It was a comment on her video, one of thousands that had appeared over the past day. Most of the early comments had been supportive, people agreeing that service providers should be held accountable. But as the video spread beyond her immediate network, the tenor had shifted. This particular comment was from someone claiming to be a marine engineer who had worked in the industry for 20 years. The person methodically broke down Marcus's explanation of the problem, pointing out that his diagnosis about corrupted control system code was not only plausible but actually demonstrated sophisticated understanding of modern yacht systems. The comment went on to note that Marcus had explained the issue clearly and professionally, had provided a realistic timeline for repairs, and had warned against rushing the work to prevent further damage. The engineer concluded by stating that any competent professional would have given the same assessment, and that the woman in the video appeared to be punishing the mechanic for telling her an inconvenient truth rather than a comforting lie. The comment had received over 2,000 likes and had spawned a long thread of responses. Victoria scrolled through them, her chest tightening with each one she read. Other industry professionals chimed in with similar assessments. Several people shared their own experiences with corrupt code in marine computer systems, confirming that it was indeed a rare but serious problem that required careful, time-consuming repair. A few commenters had even identified Marcus by name and spoke glowingly of his reputation at Harbor Point Marina, calling him one of the most honest and skilled mechanics on the coast. One person shared a story about how Marcus had once stayed 4 hours past closing to help them fix an engine problem before a family trip, refusing extra payment because he understood how important the trip was to their elderly father who was terminally ill. Victoria set her phone down and picked up the wine glass, finally taking a long drink. She had made her fortune by being smart, by gathering information and making strategic decisions, and yet she had failed to do even basic due diligence before destroying a man's livelihood. She had assumed incompetence when faced with an answer she didn't want to hear, and she had wielded her power like a weapon against someone who had no defenses against it. The realization sat in her stomach like a stone. She had been raised by parents who valued achievement above all else, who taught her that showing weakness or admitting mistakes was tantamount to failure. Apologizing had never been part of her vocabulary, especially not to people she considered beneath her station. But something about this situation felt different, perhaps because the consequences of her actions were expanding beyond what she had anticipated. Thursday morning arrived with gray clouds and the threat of rain. Victoria woke early after a restless night and checked her phone to find an email from her executive assistant marked urgent. The message explained that the video had now been picked up by several local news outlets and was being discussed on social media platforms well beyond her original audience. A few news organizations were framing it as a story about wealth inequality and the treatment of working-class people by the ultra-rich. One article had the headline "Tech CEO fires marine mechanic on camera after he tells her the truth she doesn't want to hear." Another piece interviewed other mechanics and dock workers at Harbor Point Marina, all of whom spoke highly of Marcus Thompson and expressed dismay at how he had been treated. The story was no longer contained or controllable. It was developing its own momentum, its own narrative, and Victoria was rapidly becoming the villain in a tale about class and compassion. Her public relations team held an emergency video conference at 9 o'clock. 3 consultants appeared on screen, their expressions professionally neutral but their concern evident. They recommended that Victoria take down the original video immediately, issue a public statement expressing regret for her tone and manner, and potentially reach out to Marcus Thompson privately to make amends. One consultant, a woman named Patricia who had worked in crisis management for 15 years, was more direct. She explained that this type of situation could snowball quickly in the current media environment, where stories about mistreated workers resonated powerfully with large audiences. If Victoria wanted to protect her personal brand and, more importantly, the reputation of her company. She needed to act quickly to demonstrate accountability and humanity. Victoria listened to their advice but bristled at the suggestion that she should apologize. It felt like capitulation, like admitting she had been wrong, and every instinct she possessed resisted that conclusion. Yet as the consultants outlined potential consequences, including possible impacts on investor relations, corporate partnerships, and even employee morale within her own company, she began to understand that this wasn't about pride anymore. It was about damage control. She authorized them to draft a statement, though she insisted on reviewing and approving the final version. The call ended with a plan to release something by end of business day, a carefully worded expression of regret that would walk the tightrope between acknowledging fault and maintaining her authority. But Thursday brought another development that would complicate everything. Victoria received a call from Hiroshi Tanaka's assistant, a polite but firm woman who explained that Mr. Tanaka had become aware of the viral video and had questions about the incident. He was, the assistant explained, a man who valued integrity and the treatment of all people with respect, regardless of their position. He wondered if Ms. Langford might be willing to discuss the situation and explain her perspective before the scheduled meeting on Saturday. The unspoken message was clear. If Victoria couldn't satisfy Tanaka's concerns, the entire deal was in jeopardy. Victoria felt panic grip her chest in a way she hadn't experienced since the early days of building her company, when failure meant not just professional setback but potential financial ruin. She agreed immediately to a phone call and spent the next hour preparing, rehearsing explanations and justifications. When Tanaka called, however, his questions were simple and direct. He asked her to describe what had happened at the marina. He asked why she had chosen to record and share the interaction publicly. He asked what the mechanic had actually done to warrant being fired. Victoria found herself stumbling over answers that had seemed perfectly reasonable in her mind but sounded hollow and defensive when spoken aloud. Tanaka listened without interruption, and when she finished, he was silent for a long moment before speaking. He told her a story about his own father, a man who had worked as an engineer for a major manufacturing company in Tokyo. His father had once been publicly reprimanded by an executive for pointing out a design flaw that would have delayed a product launch. The executive had ignored the warning, and 6 months later, the product failed spectacularly, costing the company millions of dollars and damaging its reputation. His father had been vindicated eventually, but the experience had taught Tanaka a lesson he never forgot. The people who tell you difficult truths are often more valuable than those who tell you what you want to hear, and how you treat them reveals more about your character than any amount of success or wealth ever could. Tanaka didn't explicitly withdraw from the Saturday meeting, but he made it clear that he would be watching how Victoria handled the situation going forward. The call ended with Victoria feeling shaken in a way that board meetings and hostile negotiations had never accomplished. This wasn't about business strategy or market positioning. This was about something more fundamental, and she wasn't sure she had the tools to navigate it. By Thursday afternoon, the Pinnacle remained inoperable. Victoria had burned through 6 different marine service companies, and none had successfully repaired the yacht. Time was running out. The investor meeting was now less than 36 hours away, and she had no viable alternatives. Relocating to a different venue would require explanations she couldn't give without looking incompetent. Canceling would be admitting defeat and likely destroying months of careful relationship building. She stood on the dock staring at her beautiful, useless yacht and felt something she rarely allowed herself to experience, which was helplessness. Olaf approached her quietly, his weathered face grave. He had been wrestling with his own conscience for days, watching his employer spiral into crisis while knowing there was a solution she refused to consider. He cleared his throat and spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone walking through a minefield. He reminded Victoria that Marcus Thompson had correctly diagnosed the problem on Tuesday morning. He pointed out that none of the expensive, supposedly elite technicians who came after him had even come close to identifying the issue. He mentioned that several marina workers had told him Marcus was widely regarded as the best diagnostic mechanic for complex yacht systems within 100 miles. And then Olaf said something that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. He told Victoria that Marcus Thompson wasn't just a good mechanic. He was a good man. Olaf described an incident from 6 months earlier when a young couple with a small sailboat had gotten stranded at the marina with a broken engine and no money for repairs. Marcus had fixed their boat after hours, using spare parts from his personal collection, and had refused payment because he remembered what it felt like to be young and struggling. Olaf shared another story about Marcus spending an entire Sunday helping an elderly yacht owner sort through mechanical problems, patiently explaining each issue and teaching the man how to perform basic maintenance so he wouldn't be taken advantage of by unscrupulous repair shops. These weren't the actions of someone incompetent or deserving of public humiliation. These were the actions of someone who genuinely cared about his work and the people he served. Victoria stood very still as Olaf spoke, feeling each word land like a gentle accusation. When he finished, she asked quietly why he was telling her this. Olaf met her eyes directly and said that he was telling her because she needed to know, and because there was still time to make a different choice. He explained that he had Marcus's phone number, that the man probably wouldn't answer a call from Victoria but might respond to a message from him, and that if she was willing to set aside her pride for just a moment, there might be a way to solve both the yacht problem and the bigger problem of what this incident had revealed about her character. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began to fall, light drops that quickly grew heavier, drumming against the deck of the Pinnacle and sending ripples across the harbor's surface. Victoria looked up at the gray sky, feeling the water on her face, and made a decision that went against every instinct she had cultivated over 20 years of ruthless business dealings. She turned to Olaf and asked him to reach out to Marcus Thompson. Not with demands or expectations, but with a simple question about whether he might be willing to talk. Olaf made the call while Victoria waited on the dock, her expensive suit growing damp from the rain. She watched through the windows of Olaf's cabin as he spoke on the phone, his expression serious and his gestures measured. The conversation lasted several minutes, longer than she expected, and when Olaf finally emerged, his face was unreadable. Marcus had answered, Olaf reported, and he had listened to the request. He hadn't said yes, but he also hadn't immediately refused. He had asked for time to think, which under the circumstances seemed like more than Victoria deserved. Olaf suggested they wait until evening before following up, to give Marcus space to consider without feeling pressured. Those hours of waiting were among the longest of Victoria's life. She returned to her penthouse but couldn't focus on work, couldn't eat, couldn't do anything but pace and replay the past few days in her mind. She thought about the video she had posted with such righteous certainty, about the comments she had made regarding Marcus's competence and work ethic, about the casual cruelty with which she had wielded her power. She thought about Hiroshi Tanaka's story and the quiet disappointment in his voice. She thought about her own parents and the values they had instilled in her, values that prioritized winning above all else but had somehow neglected to include basic human decency in the curriculum. At 7 o'clock that evening, Olaf called. Marcus Thompson had agreed to meet with Victoria the following morning, Friday, at the marina. He had made no promises about fixing the yacht or accepting any kind of apology. He had simply agreed to hear what she had to say. It was more than Victoria had any right to expect, and as she hung up the phone, she felt something unfamiliar wash over her. It took a moment to identify the sensation, and when she finally did, she realized it was shame, genuine and unfiltered, the kind that comes from recognizing you've caused harm to someone who didn't deserve it. Friday morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having passed overnight and leaving the air clean and sharp. Victoria arrived at the marina at 8 o'clock, earlier than the agreed meeting time, and found herself nervous in a way she hadn't been since her first major investor pitch 2 decades ago. She had rehearsed what she wanted to say, discarding the corporate speak and carefully constructed deflections that usually served her well. This situation called for something she wasn't practiced at delivering, which was simple, unvarnished honesty. Marcus arrived at exactly 8:30, driving his old pickup truck into the marina parking lot and climbing out slowly, as if the weight of this meeting was something physical he had to carry. He walked toward where Victoria stood near the Pinnacle, his stride steady but his expression guarded. Olaf had positioned himself nearby, not intrusive but present, a silent witness to whatever would unfold. When Marcus stopped a few feet away from Victoria, the two of them stood facing each other, separated by more than just physical distance. Between them lay the chasm of class and power, the video that had humiliated him before thousands of strangers, and the consequences that had rippled out from one woman's refusal to hear an inconvenient truth. Victoria took a breath and began to speak, and what came out was not the polished statement her PR team had drafted or the careful non-apology that powerful people often deploy. Instead, she told Marcus Thompson that she had been wrong, completely and inexcusably wrong, and that no amount of stress or pressure justified how she had treated him. She acknowledged that he had done his job professionally and correctly, and that she had punished him for refusing to tell her what she wanted to hear rather than what she needed to know. She admitted that posting the video was vindictive and cruel, and that she hadn't considered for even a moment what impact it might have on his life, his reputation, or his family. And then she did something that shocked not just Marcus but herself as well. She apologized, sincerely and without qualification, and asked if there was any way she could begin to make amends for the harm she had caused. Marcus stood on the dock listening to Victoria Langford apologize, and the words washed over him like waves against weathered stone. He had expected many things when he agreed to this meeting. He had anticipated excuses wrapped in corporate language, perhaps an offer of money to make the problem disappear, or even another confrontation where she would try to justify her actions. What he had not expected was the raw vulnerability in her voice or the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. This was not the same woman who had stood on this very dock 4 days ago, wielding her phone like a weapon and reducing him to entertainment for strangers on the internet. This woman looked tired and uncertain, stripped of the armor that wealth and power usually provided. When Victoria finished speaking, silence settled between them. The morning sounds of the marina continued around them, the clank of rigging against masts, the cry of seagulls searching for breakfast, the low rumble of a boat engine somewhere in the distance. Marcus took his time formulating a response, not because he wanted to make her uncomfortable, though part of him registered that she deserved discomfort, but because he genuinely needed to process what he had just heard. An apology from someone like Victoria Langford was rare enough to be noteworthy, but a sincere one was something else entirely. He could see Olaf standing near the yacht's stern, the captain's weathered face reflecting cautious hope mixed with concern. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quiet but steady. He told Victoria that he appreciated her apology and that it took courage to admit wrongdoing, especially for someone in her position. But he also explained that apologies, while important, didn't erase consequences. The video she had posted had been viewed by tens of thousands of people. His daughter had cried when she watched it, furious at seeing her father treated with such contempt. His son had lost sleep worrying about how his father would support himself if he couldn't find work again. His youngest had wanted to abandon her law school exams to come home and fight this battle for him. The humiliation had been public and thorough, and while her words today meant something, they couldn't undo the damage that had already spread through his life like cracks through glass. Victoria listened without interrupting, and Marcus watched her face carefully as he spoke. He saw her flinch when he mentioned his children, saw genuine remorse flicker across her features when he described the impact on his family. She nodded slowly when he finished, acknowledging the truth of what he said. She told him that she understood her apology couldn't fix everything, but that she wanted to try to make things right in whatever way she could. She offered to post a public retraction, to take down the original video, to write a statement praising his professionalism and expertise. She offered to compensate him for the days of work he had lost and to provide references that would ensure no one in the marine industry would hesitate to hire him based on this incident. Marcus considered her offers, turning them over in his mind like stones he was examining for flaws. The public retraction would help, certainly. It would give people who had seen the original video a different perspective, a counter-narrative to the story of incompetence she had initially crafted. But something about the transaction felt incomplete, as if they were negotiating a business deal rather than addressing a fundamental breach of human decency. He asked Victoria a question that seemed to catch her off guard. He asked her why she had really come here this morning. Was it because she genuinely regretted her actions, or was it because the situation had become inconvenient for her, because investors were having second thoughts and her reputation was taking hits she hadn't anticipated? The question hung in the air between them, sharp and unavoidable. Victoria's first instinct was clearly to offer a diplomatic answer, something that would position her response in the best possible light. Marcus could see her mentally reaching for the kind of polished reply she probably used in boardrooms and press conferences. But then something shifted in her expression, a subtle collapse of the defenses she had been maintaining, and what came out was something closer to raw truth. She admitted that initially, yes, the crisis with the yacht and the investor concerns had motivated her to reach out. She confessed that her first impulse had been damage control rather than genuine remorse. But she also said that somewhere in the process of watching this situation unfold, of reading comments from people who knew Marcus and spoke of his character, of hearing Olaf and others defend him while she had no defenders, she had been forced to confront some uncomfortable realities about herself. She told Marcus about Hiroshi Tanaka's phone call and the story about his father, about how that conversation had stirred something in her that went beyond concern for a business deal. She described sitting in her penthouse the previous night, unable to sleep, thinking about the kind of person she had become in her pursuit of success. She had built an empire, yes, but what had she sacrificed to build it? She had accumulated wealth beyond most people's imagination, but when had she last used that wealth to help someone rather than simply accumulate more? She had power and influence, but she had wielded them carelessly, without consideration for the human beings who stood in her path. The video incident had been a mirror held up to show her reflection, and she didn't like what she saw. Marcus listened to this confession with mixed feelings. Part of him remained skeptical, wondering if this was just another performance, a more sophisticated manipulation designed to get what she needed from him. But another part, the part that his late wife Amanda had always said was too generous for his own good, recognized something genuine in Victoria's struggle to articulate these revelations. He had seen real remorse only a handful of times in his life, and it always looked uncomfortable on people who weren't accustomed to it. It looked exactly like what he was seeing now on Victoria Langford's face. After a long pause, Marcus asked Victoria what she needed from him today. Not what she wanted to offer him, but what she actually needed. Victoria glanced toward the Pinnacle, her $5 million yacht that sat silent and useless at the dock, then back to Marcus. She explained the situation with the investor meeting scheduled for tomorrow, the importance of this particular gathering, and the cascade of failures from every marine service company she had contacted. She told him that multiple technicians had tried and failed to fix the problem he had correctly diagnosed 4 days ago. Then she asked, with none of the demanding tone from their first encounter, if he would be willing to repair the yacht's computer system. Not as an employee she was ordering around, but as a skilled professional whose expertise she desperately needed and had foolishly rejected. Marcus had anticipated this request. It was, after all, the most obvious reason for Victoria to seek him out beyond simple apology. He stood quietly for a moment, watching a small sailboat glide across the harbor in the distance, its white sail bright against the blue water. The question wasn't whether he could fix the yacht. He knew he could, probably in the 4 to 5 hours he had originally estimated. The question was whether he should. Whether extending help to someone who had hurt him so deeply would be wisdom or weakness. Whether showing grace in this situation would reinforce the lesson Victoria claimed to have learned or simply teach her that apologies were just another tool for getting what she wanted. He thought about what Amanda would advise if she were here. She had always believed that doing the right thing wasn't conditional on whether others deserved it. She used to say that your character wasn't defined by how you treated people who treated you well, but by how you treated people who treated you poorly. She had lived that philosophy even when it cost her, even when people took advantage of her kindness, because she believed that the alternative was allowing cruelty to change who you were at your core. Marcus had tried to live by the same principle since her death, though it had gotten harder over the years as the world seemed to reward selfishness more often than generosity. He looked at Victoria and told her he would fix the yacht, but on certain conditions. First, she would take down the original video immediately, not later today or when it was convenient, but right now while he watched. Second, she would post a public statement that didn't just retract her accusations but explicitly acknowledge that he had been right in his diagnosis and professional in his conduct, and that her treatment of him had been unjustified and wrong. Third, she would make a donation of $50,000 to the Harbor Point Marina Workers Fund, a small nonprofit that provided emergency assistance to dock workers and marine service employees who faced unexpected financial hardships. The donation would be in his late wife's name, Amanda Thompson, and it would help people like the young mechanics and boat handlers who worked 60-hour weeks and still struggled to make rent. Victoria agreed to all three conditions without hesitation. She pulled out her phone immediately and navigated to her social media account, showing Marcus as she deleted the original video from every platform where she had posted it. Then she opened a note-taking app and began drafting the statement he had requested, reading it aloud as she typed and accepting his suggestions for revisions. When the statement was complete, she posted it immediately, tagging it with the same hashtags she had used on the original video to ensure it would reach the same audience. Finally, she called her personal assistant and instructed the woman to arrange the donation to the Marina Workers Fund, providing the specific amount and the name to be associated with the gift. Marcus watched these actions with careful attention, verifying that Victoria was following through on each commitment. When she finished and looked at him expectantly, he nodded and picked up the tool bag he had brought with him. He hadn't been certain he would need it, hadn't been sure this meeting would end with him agreeing to help, but some part of him had hoped for the possibility of resolution rather than continued conflict. He followed Olaf onto the pinnacle and made his way down to the engine room, the familiar surroundings of machinery and technology providing a strange sort of comfort after the emotional intensity of the conversation above deck. Victoria asked if she could watch him work, and Marcus agreed, though he explained that watching someone troubleshoot computer code wasn't particularly exciting. She followed him down anyway, standing in the corner of the engine room while he connected his diagnostic equipment to the yacht's main computer system. As he worked, accessing layers of software and tracing through lines of code, he explained what he was doing in simple terms. He showed her where the corruption had occurred, how it had disrupted the command sequence that started the engines, and why none of the other technicians had found it. Most marine mechanics, he explained, were trained to handle mechanical problems and basic electrical issues. Complex software debugging required additional specialized knowledge that many in the industry simply didn't possess. Victoria listened intently, asking questions that suggested she was genuinely trying to understand rather than just making conversation. At one point she asked how he had learned to work with marine computer systems when many mechanics of his generation hadn't adapted to the digital age. Marcus explained that he had taken night classes for 3 years about a decade ago, paying out of pocket to learn programming in digital systems because he recognized that modern boats were becoming more computer than machine. He had studied while his children did their homework at the kitchen table, all of them bent over textbooks and assignments, a family united in the pursuit of education even if the subjects were different. The work took just over 4 hours, exactly within the range Marcus had originally predicted. He isolated the corrupted code, cleaned the affected files, and restored the proper startup sequence. When he powered up the engines, they roared to life with the smooth, powerful hum of perfectly functioning machinery. Olaf, who had been monitoring the process from the bridge, called down to confirm that all systems showed green across the board. The Pinnacle was operational again, ready for Victoria's important investor meeting the following morning. Marcus packed up his equipment methodically, securing each tool in its proper place in his bag. Victoria had been mostly quiet during the final hour of work, seemingly lost in thought. When he finished and turned to leave, she stopped him with a question. She asked what it had been like, carrying the knowledge that he could fix this problem while watching her cycle through company after company, each one failing where he would have succeeded. Had he felt vindicated? Had he hoped she would fail and be humiliated the way she had humiliated him? Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. He told her honestly that yes, there had been moments of bitter satisfaction in knowing she was struggling with a problem she had prevented him from solving. There had been a small, hurt part of him that wanted her to suffer consequences for her actions. But mostly, he said, he had just felt sad. Sad that the situation had unfolded the way it did, sad that they had both been diminished by the confrontation, sad that in a world with so many real problems, they had created unnecessary conflict through pride and impatience and the assumption that power gave someone the right to treat others poorly. Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing his words. She thanked him for his honesty and for his willingness to help despite having every reason to refuse. She asked if there was anything else she could do, any other way she could demonstrate that her apology and her commitment to doing better were genuine. Marcus told her that actions over time would mean more than any single gesture. He suggested that the next time she encountered a service worker, a mechanic, a contractor, anyone whose labor supported her lifestyle, she might try seeing them as a complete human being rather than just a function to be performed. He suggested that she might consider what it would be like to live on their wages, to face their challenges, to carry their worries, and to then interact with someone who had the power to make their day harder or easier with a single decision. As Marcus prepared to leave the yacht, Victoria stopped him one more time. She asked if he would be willing to meet again in a few weeks, after the investor meeting and after the immediate crisis had passed. Not for business purposes, she clarified, but simply to talk. She said she wanted to learn more about his approach to his work and his life, and that she thought spending time around someone with his perspective might help her become the kind of person she had claimed to be but had failed to actually embody. Marcus didn't commit to anything specific but said he would consider it, and that was enough for now. Olaf walked Marcus back to his truck, and the two men shook hands firmly. The captain thanked Marcus for coming, for being willing to set aside justified anger in service of a solution. He mentioned that he had been watching Victoria carefully over the past few days and believed the crisis had genuinely affected her in ways that might lead to lasting change, though only time would tell if that change took root or withered under the pressures of returning to her normal life. Marcus appreciated Olaf's perspective and said he hoped the captain was right, because the world could use more people with power and resources choosing to wield them with wisdom and compassion rather than casual cruelty. As Marcus drove away from the marina, he felt the weight of the past week begin to lift slightly from his shoulders. The situation wasn't fully resolved, and the hurt from the public humiliation would take time to heal completely, but at least it was moving in a direction that didn't leave him bitter and diminished. He thought about calling his children to update them, knowing Jennifer would be relieved, Michael would be philosophical, and Emma would probably be disappointed that there wouldn't be a lawsuit. He smiled slightly at that thought, grateful for their fierce love even when it manifested as righteous fury on his behalf. When he arrived home, he sat in his truck in the driveway for a few minutes, looking at the house that held so many memories of Amanda and their life together. He wondered what she would think of how he had handled this situation, whether she would approve of his decision to help Victoria despite everything. But deep down, he knew the answer. Amanda had always believed in second chances, in the possibility of redemption, and in responding to cruelty with grace not because it was easy but because it was right. He had honored her memory not by seeking revenge or letting bitterness take root, but by staying true to the values they had built their marriage and their family around. And that, he decided as he finally climbed out of the truck and walked toward his front door, was victory enough. Saturday morning arrived with perfect weather, the kind of brilliant coastal day that seemed designed specifically for luxury yacht outings. The sky stretched overhead in endless blue, and the harbor waters sparkled like scattered diamonds under the early sun. Victoria stood on the deck of the Pinnacle as her catering staff made final preparations below, arranging elaborate presentations of food that most people would never taste in their lifetimes. The yacht's engines hummed smoothly beneath her feet, a sound that yesterday had seemed impossible and today felt almost miraculous. Hiroshi Tanaka arrived first, precisely 15 minutes before the scheduled departure time, accompanied by his assistant and two associates from his investment firm. Victoria greeted them personally, her practiced business smile in place, but beneath the professional veneer she felt unusually nervous. Tanaka's sharp eyes swept across the yacht's deck, taking in every detail with the assessment of someone who missed nothing. He greeted Victoria with polite formality, and as the other investors began arriving, she guided everyone through introductions and small talk that felt more strained than usual. The voyage itself went smoothly from a logistical standpoint. The Pinnacle performed flawlessly, gliding through the water with the quiet power that $5 million in engineering could provide. The catering was exceptional, the presentations were polished, and Victoria delivered her pitch for the quantum computing venture with the confidence and expertise that had made her successful. But throughout the day, she found herself distracted by thoughts that had nothing to do with artificial intelligence or investment returns. She kept thinking about Marcus Thompson, about the steadiness in his voice when he had agreed to help her despite having every reason to refuse, about the way he had spoken of his late wife and the values she had instilled in their family. When the formal presentations concluded and the gathering transitioned into more casual conversation, Tanaka approached Victoria near the yacht's stern, where she stood watching the coastline slide past in the distance. He commented on the successful repair of the engines and asked, with characteristic directness, what had ultimately resolved the problem. Victoria could have offered a vague corporate answer, something about finding the right technical specialist. Instead, she found herself telling him the truth. She explained that the mechanic she had fired and humiliated earlier in the week had been the one to fix the yacht, and that he had done so only after she had apologized and acknowledged how wrongly she had treated him. Tanaka listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. When she finished, he nodded slowly and told her that her honesty was appreciated and noteworthy. He said that in his experience, the leaders worth investing in were not those who never made mistakes, but those who could recognize their errors and take meaningful steps to address them. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Victoria sensed that something had shifted in Tanaka's assessment of her, not negatively but perhaps in a way that added dimension to his understanding of who she was beyond the polished presentations and financial projections. By the time the Pinnacle returned to the marina that evening, Victoria had secured commitments from 2 of the 3 investment groups present, including Tanaka's consortium. It was a professional triumph that should have left her elated, but instead she felt strangely subdued. She thanked her staff, bid farewell to her guests, and stood alone on the deck as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Olaf approached and congratulated her on the successful meeting, and she thanked him not just for his work that day but for his honesty earlier in the week, for pushing her to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. Monday morning found Marcus back at Oceanside Marine Services. Robert Chen had called him Saturday afternoon with news that several clients had specifically requested his return, and that the marina's business had actually increased over the past week, fueled partly by the public attention from Victoria's retraction statement. People who had read about the situation online were seeking out the mechanic who had been vindicated, wanting to support someone they saw as representing honesty and integrity in a world that often seemed short on both qualities. Marcus was grateful for the work but uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to simply return to the quiet satisfaction of fixing engines and solving problems. The donation Victoria had made to the Harbor Point Marina Workers Fund became public knowledge within days, and the impact rippled through the community in ways both immediate and lasting. 3 families facing eviction received emergency assistance. A young dock worker whose mother needed surgery got help covering medical bills that insurance wouldn't pay. An elderly boat mechanic who had worked at the marina for 40 years was able to afford the hearing aids he desperately needed but had been putting off because of the cost. Each story reinforced Marcus's belief that sometimes the best outcome of difficult situations was not personal vindication but the opportunity to help others who were struggling with challenges similar to those he had faced. Victoria did reach out 3 weeks later, as she had suggested, asking if Marcus would be willing to meet for coffee. He agreed, curious about whether the change he had witnessed at the marina would prove temporary or genuine. They met at a small cafe in town, far from the wealthy enclaves where Victoria usually spent her time, and talked for over 2 hours about everything from family to work philosophy to the strange ways life humbles people when they least expect it. Victoria shared that she had begun volunteering one afternoon a week at a nonprofit that helped low-income families with basic car and boat repairs, work that put her in direct contact with people whose lives looked nothing like hers but whose struggles she was beginning to understand in more than abstract terms. Marcus found himself cautiously optimistic about Victoria's trajectory, though he remained realistic about how difficult genuine change could be for someone so accustomed to power and privilege. He shared stories about his own journey after Amanda's death, about learning to be both mother and father to his children while working endless hours to keep them fed and housed, about the moments of despair and the small kindnesses from others that had kept him going. Victoria listened with an attention that seemed authentic, asking questions that suggested she was processing rather than just being polite. Their conversation eventually led to a discussion about the nature of work and dignity, about how society often devalued the very people whose labor made comfortable lives possible for others. Marcus explained that he had never felt ashamed of being a mechanic, never felt that his work was less important than someone in an executive suite, because he understood that fixing engines was fundamentally about enabling people's lives to function. Every boat he repaired represented someone's livelihood or recreation or family time, and knowing that his skill contributed to those aspects of human experience gave his work profound meaning. Victoria admitted that she had never thought about service work that way, had always unconsciously absorbed society's hierarchy that placed financial success above other forms of contribution. The weeks turned into months, and a strange sort of friendship developed between the wealthy CEO and the working-class mechanic. They met occasionally, always at Victoria's instigation but with Marcus's genuine willingness to continue the conversation. She began consulting him not about yacht repairs but about business decisions that had human implications, asking for his perspective on how policies might affect the workers and contractors her company depended on. He appreciated being asked and offered honest assessments that she seemed to genuinely consider when making final decisions. Marcus eventually told his children about the ongoing connection with Victoria, and their reactions varied predictably. Jennifer remained skeptical, warning her father not to let himself be used for some wealthy woman's redemption narrative. Michael was intrigued by the philosophical dimensions of the relationship, seeing it as a real-world case study in moral growth and class consciousness. Emma grudgingly admitted that Victoria's actions following the initial incident suggested at least some capacity for learning, though she maintained that one billionaire becoming slightly less terrible didn't solve any systemic problems. On the anniversary of Amanda's death, Marcus visited her grave as he did every year, bringing fresh flowers and sitting on the grass beside her headstone to tell her about everything that had happened. He talked about the humiliation at the marina, about Victoria's apology and his decision to help her anyway, about the donation that had helped so many families in Amanda's name, and about the unexpected friendship that had emerged from the wreckage of that awful confrontation. He told her that he had tried to handle it all the way she would have wanted, with grace and integrity even when anger would have been justified, and he hoped she would be proud of the choice he had made. As Marcus drove home from the cemetery that evening, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Victoria, a simple note saying that she had just been informed the Marina Workers Fund had helped its 50th family, and that she wanted him to know how much that mattered. She added that she had learned more about what actually constituted success in life from him than from any business mentor she had ever had, and she was grateful for his patience with someone who had needed to learn lessons she should have understood decades ago. Marcus read the message at a stoplight and smiled slightly. The world hadn't fundamentally changed. Inequality still existed, power still corrupted, and most wealthy people would never question their assumptions about the value of different kinds of work. But in this small corner of existence, something had shifted. One person had been forced to see beyond her privilege, and in doing so had discovered that the mechanic she had dismissed as incompetent possessed wisdom she desperately needed. And one man had chosen grace over bitterness, help over revenge, and in doing so had honored both his late wife's values and his own belief that people deserve chances to become better than they had been. The evening sky stretched overhead as Marcus drove through familiar streets toward home, and somewhere in the harbor, the Pinnacle sat moored and silent, its engines ready to roar to life whenever called upon, maintained and cared for by the very man who had been deemed unworthy of touching them just months before. And that, Marcus thought as he pulled into his driveway, was perhaps the most fitting ending to a story that had begun with humiliation and somehow found its way to redemption. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.